Welcome. Good evening. My name is Andrea Louie, and I'm the Executive Director of the Serica Initiative. Our mission is to amplify the impact of the Asian diaspora in America through storytelling, empowering, and convening. Education has always been central to our community's story, but the admissions landscape today is more competitive and more complex than ever before. That's why tonight's conversation is so incredibly important. We're incredibly honored to be partnering with AtomicMind for this program. AtomicMind has become known for its deep admissions intelligence and its ability to help students not only just build resumes, but build meaningful narratives. Before we begin, I also want to invite you to join us this Friday for an upcoming program at 12 noon Eastern for another free webinar, Leading with Impact, Celebrating Asian American Voices in the Boardroom. We'll be joined by 3 accomplished AAPI women serving on public company boards, Jane Lee, Judy Lee, and our board member, Lisa Lim, for a conversation about leadership and representation at the highest levels of corporate America. You can register at sericainitiative.org, and we'd love to see you there. So now it's my incredible pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Leelila Strogov is the founder and CEO of AtomicMind, a global education consulting firm that helps ambitious students gain admission to the world's most selective schools. What sets Leelila apart is her belief that students must author their own stories, not just collect achievements. Leelila works with families around the world and brings a global perspective shaped by living in Europe and in Asia, and along with a deep knowledge of AP, IB, and other international academic systems. A graduate of MIT, she blends analytical rigor with creative storytelling, drawing from her background as a journalist, a filmmaker, and editor. And she helps students stand out in really authentic and compelling ways. Tonight, she's here to share what really happens inside those admissions offices, which I know for most of us is such a mystery, and how students can strategically and thoughtfully position themselves for success. So please join me in welcoming Leelila Strogov, who is also a board member of the Serica Initiative and whose support we're so incredibly proud to have. So Leelila, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, I just wanted to give you, a little bit of background on me. I am a former investigative journalist, and I have found that in my 20 years now of doing this work, that's actually come in very handy because many things on the admission front, as you can imagine, from stories that you hear, doesn't make a whole lot of sense until you really, really know the inner workings, right? So I think, one of the things that I've come to realize after, again, doing this work for so long is that there is no actual randomness to the process. I know people like to say it's random, it's not personal. And I actually have a very different take in that there is always a reason. So there is always a reason for why you get in and why you don't get in. And usually in the kind of post diagnostic time frame, sometimes I even have families coming to me after our kids have not gotten in, wanting some kind of an explanation. I can usually provide it. And being able to do that as well as work with students on our own has really shaped the way I think of admissions. And, a little fun fact about me, I happen to be married to an Asian man and I have Asian children. So this does feel very personal for me. And I would say I feel a lot more Asian than I probably look. So, and one of the challenges in Asian student admissions is this. It really is a little bit of a group. It becomes a little bit of a group think tank. And I feel like sometimes that can actually be harmful because then you have people who are all trying to do exactly the same thing. And then you've got competing narratives that are extraordinarily similar to one another. And so I think differentiation amongst the Asian population really needs to be a huge priority. To that end, I would say, when I talk to Asian families, and I do very much want a lot of, your questions to be pretty personally answered. So, I would encourage you to share those. But when it comes to Asian admissions, I do find that there's a lot of herd instinct going on. There's a lot of, oh, but we must do this and we must take these APs and we must engage in these specific competitions. And then what you get is a huge number of people doing exactly the same thing. And what happens is it becomes a little bit of a recreation of admissions systems that are native to, let's say, China, where then it becomes, oh, well, if 1,000 people entered this one competition, who are the 10 best? That's who the colleges are going to take. But then you've got a whole slew of people who essentially disqualify themselves from what could have otherwise been an extraordinarily compelling candidacy just because they decided to compete in much the same way anyone else would compete. And so for me, I think the key is creating these layers of originality that really become things that no one can actually compete with. If you have a story that is so singular to you and that creates both a factor of, wow, this kid is super impressive, but this kid is also inspiring because they're doing things so differently and originally. That truly becomes the power play for the Asian applicant. So I think, that's something that in my mind is extremely important. So, yeah, does anyone have any, I'm sure there's a lot of burning questions and I'd love to like really speak to what is actually on your mind. Andrea, I'm not sure if I can see all the questions, so I'm just trying to make sure that.
Hi, Leelila. Just really quick, were you going to introduce V and
Oh
do any
yeah,
sort of
so
presentation at all, or before we
yeah,
get into the
yeah. So
questions?
V is our kind of insider Princeton rep, and she's here to also, and I see a question now. Yeah, V is here to talk about Princeton admissions specifically. After we get into, more of like the meat and potatoes of the admissions criteria. And so and here it is, how is it really different, right, from assessing some of the other candidates, and what are some of the activities that would set apart from the Asian norm? I love these questions, and this is, one of the reasons why I wanted to run this in this kind of style. So really what happens is the activities that would set people apart from the Asian norm, I will say across the board, it tends to be going in a non-STEM direction. So the majority of Asian applicants are going for STEM. The second you decide to go for humanities or social sciences, or even something quite interdisciplinary, such as philosophy of science or history of science, anything that is not in the pure STEM realm will actually help to set an Asian applicant apart. So that would be, one of the very first things that I will say. One of the other things that I'm going to speak to, and this is where, I really want parents to think of admissions as it's sort of these silos of screenings that take place. So in that first silo, so let's just give an example. 27,000 people are, applying for admission. You've got the first edict in any admissions committee round is all of these applications are given to readers and they are told to look at only three things. They are told to look at the grades, the scores, and the recommendation letters, and nothing else. So this is before they are getting to your actual application, your activities lists, all of these things. And what happens is it is the first screen, that screen of grades, scores, recommendation letters that will determine whether or not you make it into the next screen, the next round of screens. So in that first screen, for many of the top colleges, the edict is eliminate 50% off the bat. So when you're talking about even colleges with a very self-selecting bunch of people, so let's say a Stanford, a Harvard, an MIT, most kids applying to those schools are fairly qualified. But 50% of them off the bat from either the grades, the scores, or the recommendation letters will be deemed inappropriately fit to have their full applications read. It is in that the aftermath of that screen that the other 50% of the applicants are being handed off to the admissions committees with the edict of now read the entire application. And before we even go to committee, we're going to eliminate again 50% of that pile. And that's after reading the actual lists, the awards, the honors, the activities. That is when you make it into that second round. So one of the most crucial elements of this process, and this part, by the way, is not specific to Asian students, but what I'm about to say will be, one of the most crucial elements of the process is, can you make it past that first silo, that first round? And what I will say is that oftentimes, it is the grades and the scores that the Asian applicant can very handily pass the screen for. Where things get tricky in that very first screen tends to be the rec letters. It is the rec letters that will determine whether or not you make it into the next screen, provided you have the cutoff grades and scores for your application to be read. At that point, and many people don't realize this, the recommendation letters are being written by teachers who are very subtly distinguishing between applicants. So, for example, they might be writing about your child. This is a student teachers dream of having. But at the same time, they are writing about someone in your child's class. This is the best student I've seen in my 27 years of being in education. So just know that there are these really subtle differences that make a huge difference as to whether or not a student will make it from that very first screen into the next pile. And it is in that next pile that I would say that there's a vast amount of differentiation that can take place, because that's where the Asian student tends to be on average far stronger if you just look at the list of accomplishments than any other, honestly, race, period. You've just got a very strong group of people. And so what happens is you're trying to distinguish yourself within a group of people whose families already value education in some extraordinary way. So there are a lot of similar things going on. A lot of kids who are entering the same science competitions, the same science fairs, the same STEM awards, doing a lot of the same summer programs, chasing a lot of the Ivy League summer things. So really, a lot of the differentiation has to take place on not not doing all of those same things. And I will always tell an Asian applicant to choose something that differentiates them over trying to compete in an already saturated bucket of students who are chasing the quote unquote measurables. So the as many APs as you can take with as many fives as you can get. There will always be an advantage there. And that's where that differentiation really has to happen. It has to happen in making these discoveries on what looks unusual. And in terms of summer programs, one of the things I always say to Asian parents is don't do more than one Ivy League summer program. When you start to do too many, you look like a status seeker instead of a knowledge seeker. So you can find very selective, prestigious, highly enriching programs that are not affiliated with Ivy League colleges. But if you have one summer doing, Yale Young Global Scholars, and one doing something at Stanford, and one doing something at Columbia, you will end up looking like a status seeker, and the colleges don't want that. They want to see that you are actually driven by intellectual curiosity, by other desires that they view as higher in their desirability handbook than I just got into all of these selective programs at Ivy League schools. So, so I'm really starting with that, and then I'm gonna look at some of these questions now. So some of the activities that might set a student apart from the Asian norm would really be, again, activities in the humanities, in the social sciences, and some really unique interdisciplinary work in not the most obvious Ivy League places. That is really what I can say. So let's say doing a history program. There's something called the St. Albans Institute that is, one of my favorites. It's on public service. There's Siegel. It's the School for Ethics and Global Leadership. Again, when we're talking about public service, politics, history, and again, even history of science, doing research in history of science. So just as an example, I had a student who did some very in-depth research on, and they were STEMmy, but they did some very in-depth research on how the lobotomy, right? So this is a student interested in the biological sciences, but did an entire 20 plus page research paper on how the lobotomy had been irresponsibly popularized by the media, right? So it's this idea that this was such a horrible thing that caused so much harm in society, but the media was actually at fault because they just fell in love with the idea of you going in with a pinhole into the brain and tinkering with some stuff. And they popularized something that was actually ultimately very bad for humanity. We have another student who took on a deep research paper on how Darwin was essentially the influencer of his time, how there were other scientists at the time with very similar ideas on evolution, but how Darwin is the one who actually pushed the agenda forward because he thought in such a strong marketing sense, and he infiltrated all of society's top minds, whether it was professors, intellectuals in salons, people at newspapers. He was just very smart about how he went through that process. So again, I would say these are very unique things. These are not, oh, I did the Conrad Diamond Challenge, because they see that over and over and over again. So you're really trying to stay away from things they have already seen, and you're trying to lean into something new. And that is incredibly hard to do. It requires a lot of thought, a lot of creativity, a lot of investigation, a lot of inquiry, but it's important to do it. So I'm seeing another Q&A. Is it important to continue with extracurricular activities throughout high school, like orchestra? So I'll give you my take on that. So really, yes, you want to show consistency across years, but in general, ninth grade is typically seen as a year for exploration. So you're allowed to try a lot of things, and you can have more than your usual set of extracurricular activities in ninth grade because you are by nature young and in a very exploratory phase. So in this phase, you might try mock trial, you might try debate, you might try the STEM clubs, you might try the economics club, you might do history, you might do debate, you might do student government. You can do all kinds of things. By 10th grade is when you really need to start narrowing these things down and being able to think about how that narrative is going to evolve. And we are always very mindful of that. Even when we work with students from just before ninth grade, we're always very mindful of like, where is the narrative going to shift starting in 10th grade? And then it gets narrower still in 11th grade. And I would say not only narrower, but even wider. So you're narrowing in really in 10th grade on what you're interested in. And then in 11th grade, you're starting to do, you're really starting to do some really original, interesting things in even 10th grade, but they become a lot bigger in 11th grade. So in 10th grade, you might be doing, let's say, 5-page, 6-page, 8-page type things. When it gets to 11th grade, you're doing much longer things. You're investigating much more deeply. And you're also starting to tie in you're starting to really develop a thread around your narrative. So this is really the place where, and I'm just throwing, examples out there, where let's say we've got an athlete as an example who decides that they're very interested in history. This is where they might decide, and they're taking French, let's say, as their secondary language. This is where they might decide to embark on really in-depth research on the existence of racism in sports in French-speaking countries, right? And these are people who are also doing volunteer work in their communities with underrepresented people of color. So there's all kinds of things that end up needing to kind of blend and come together to create this narrative. And for something like orchestra, what I would say is yes, if you're serious about music, show that seriousness about music. Do the competitions, do orchestra, stay with it, because at the end of the day, it's the things that you are best at. Together with it's almost, think about it as like majors and minors, but more in terms of interests. So it's like these few things that you've developed extraordinary mastery and expertise in that is really going to tell your broader story. And then it's the other stuff that's going to come in as kind of the minor, or sometimes, like I call it, the spice. So you might be in the cooking club, you might do some other things that are just cool and interesting, but aren't really a part of your major narrative. They're just showing that you have dimension, right? That you're interesting on all kinds of levels. And then I'm going to get to this question about how important the interview is in the application process. So, you know, what happens is the interview is not required for every school. There are actually schools that place a lot of importance on the interview, and some that place very little importance, and others that don't have interviews at all. So, as an example, Columbia no longer interviews. They consider the recommendation letters from your teachers and any other kind of outside recommendation letters the key to your personal traits and qualities. So, they're trusting people who speak on your behalf to tell them about your character and your personality and your ability to lead people towards a common good. There are other schools for which the interview is of supreme importance, and I would say those are really Stanford, Yale, Harvard are probably at the highest levels of that. So the interview really does matter a lot. In part because these are schools that, in their minds, they're set on producing the future leaders, whether it's in business, in society, in government. Uh, that's what they want, and in their minds, personality is going to be a big part of actually executing on the leadership that you're capable of. So it is quite important. Okay, so I'm going to answer this question of, do I think there's an advantage to Asian kids who go to top US boarding schools versus those who attend a top international school in China? Yes, there definitely is an advantage, but the advantage lies in coming to the States. So I would say that there is an advantage to being in the States at the time of application, especially in today's times. So the voices from within the United States are ultimately a little bit more trusted than the voices in China. There's also a trend of many of the top colleges are only taking from very specific schools in China and not others. And so once you are in the States, it becomes a lot easier than if you are in Asia and you are not a US passport holder. So, that's a little bit of a different, a different set of rules, but it is always going to be harder for foreign students to get into American colleges. At the end of the day, the primary role of American colleges is to serve American students, and the foreign enrollment is seen to some degree to really be for the benefit of the American students and the benefit of the experience as a whole, as opposed to this sort of benefit you know, in fact, it's almost seen as a little bit of a detractor because they're facing possible brain drain, right? There's always this idea that the student may be coming to these colleges with the intent of returning home with that knowledge and using that knowledge to strengthen the home country. And so just know that that is always going to be in the back of people's minds when you don't have a US passport holder. And it is easier when you have students who've already been integrated in the American setting for 4 years before going to college. That is always going to be a little bit more of an advantage because in the college's mind, they stand to benefit their American colleagues more than somebody who just came straight from China to college. There is no difference between a green card holder and a citizen from an admissions perspective. So to answer that question. So you are treated very much in the same pool. But again, I think like subconsciously there may still be a bias there, subconsciously, but technically speaking, you are put into the same bucket if you're a green card holder. So yeah, so to that end, what I would say is the messaging that I would try to send your kids and you as parents is really try to figure out, on the very foundational side, the grades and the scores are supremely important because it is those things that will essentially determine where you are eligible to apply, where you might get beyond that first round of screening and into the second round of having your candidacy looked at very deeply. But equally important, because without both of them, you cannot get it. Equally important is one, developing very strong relationships with your teachers and all the administrators to make sure that they are really behind you when the time comes for those recommendation letters. So that if you are that kid who's in the highest, who's ranked in the top, let's say 10 percentile of their class in terms of grades and scores, that they will also stand out in those recommendation letters as being truly, I mean, the last thing you want these teachers to say is, oh, this kid bothered me all year to get an A, right? So you really want your student to be speaking to their teachers in far deeper ways about the curriculum, about the lecture, about what they learned that day, about what they read, about an article that they read that's related to what they're studying in class. Those are the kids who will ultimately fly. Those are the kids who will get those recommendation letters that will really distinguish themselves from the very top of the pack. So that is something you have to make sure your kids know how to do. Then once you're over, right, that hurdle of grades, scores, rec letters, and you're over on the other side, know that then you're being evaluated on your leadership skills. What have you accomplished? What have you taken on in terms of awards and honors, and not just the usual suspects? What are you doing to make the world a better place? How are you leading people in ways that are going to make the world a better place? Whether that's making the planet more sustainable, or whether that's fostering constructive dialogue, or whether that's becoming a communicator in STEM so that the layperson can understand what the scientists are saying, and you may become that government person or the person who's working at the NIH and can very freely communicate with the stakeholders in government. These are the kinds of questions they're asking themselves. They're not only looking at, oh, can this kid handle the rigor? They have way too many kids applying who can handle the rigor. What they really want is which one of these kids is going to do something incredibly different. That means not go into finance, not go into consulting, really do something original to make the world a better place. That is the frame through which they are looking and evaluating your kid. So make sure they've got a story to tell there. That's really the key. You see these stories, you know what makes you go, wow, that's a really interesting person. That applies to your kid too. Get them to do interesting things in interesting and inspired ways. Um, so I'm going to look at some of these questions here. Um, does it improve or reduce your chances to specify. So what's really interesting to specify your race. Right now, we are at a moment in time where, believe it or not, the admissions officers actually cannot see your race. So they don't know about your race in any kind of formal way. Even if you're filling out check boxes, those check boxes are no longer seen until after the admissions process is over. So really what's happening is you might be filling out those boxes, but if you don't talk about it, they won't know. So that information is actually blacked out. The real issue comes with the fact that, again, the admissions officers are savvy enough to be able to suss out a stereotypical Asian applicant from the mix, whether or not they say they're Asian or Asian American. So again, sometimes the resume just looks like that of an Asian applicant. And that is where, yes, it hurts you to be Asian, but it is not that your race is hurting you. It is that Asian families tend to place a lot of value on a much narrower band of things. And so they end up looking very much alike just in terms of resume or on paper. And that is what we truly have to actively avoid. So, so again, it's not a tendency for racial discrimination. I would say it's more a tendency towards cultural discrimination, because what the colleges are saying is we don't want everyone with the same values and the same value system in education. And we can see that these are your values right here. It's becoming very apparent. And we want a variety of perspectives and values to enter into the fold. What's my advice on how to choose the people who write your recommendation and how to make this request? So this is one of the most important things you're going to end up deciding. So in your junior year, you will be picking two academic teachers. It will typically be one from STEM and one from the humanities. So you will be getting one from either your math or science teacher in 11th grade, and you will be getting in addition to that, your whoever serves as the college counselor at your school will be writing that third letter. So it's really that triumvirate, that threesome that is going to create your recommender profile. And what I always tell students is pick a teacher who is going to glow. A lot of times students are thinking to themselves, oh, is this teacher going to be a good writer? Are they it doesn't matter. The key is this teacher has to truly, truly love and appreciate you for your contributions in the classroom, for your discussions with them, for the things you're taking on. And one of the things, I always tell students, especially in 11th grade, is when you're taking on the kinds of research initiatives that we encourage our students to take on, you always want to bring your teachers into the fold. That is one of the ways you can stand out to them. So you can literally say, hey, I'm entering the John Locke essay competition in the category of philosophy, and I was wondering if you could please give me some feedback and guidance on this initial draft that I have. You may or may not need that guidance, especially when you're working with us, but we encourage you anyway to use that as a part of the relationship building process. Because then at the end of the year, when that teacher is writing your rec letter, they get to say, and I worked with the student on this competition essay, on this piece of research. And it was what a wonderful process. They responded so well to all of my feedback. It was such a pleasure working with them on this, right? So it gives not only legitimacy to the research itself, but it also helps to strengthen that relationship with the teacher. So that's really the way to strengthen the relationship, is to take it beyond the boundaries of just the classroom. And you literally just make that request. So you request, usually it's in the spring of your junior year, you're going to a teacher and saying, I feel like you know me very well. Do you feel like you would be able to offer me a strong recommendation? And if your sense is correct, you will usually pick the right person if you're picking somebody you feel just really loves you. Is creative writing a saturated major in humanities? Is it better to combine creative writing with other areas to make it more multidisciplinary? Yes, to a degree, creative writing within the humanities can be somewhat saturated. I would say um, the bigger issue, I don't, it's not nearly as tough as STEM. So I would pick creative writing over STEM any day. But I would say that you've got creative writers are typically extremely prolific in terms of the awards that they get. So when you are a creative writer, what will really be at a disadvantage if you're a creative writer is if all you have is, let's say, three Scholastic awards. That is extremely common. Scholastic is not that highly valued. So, really, what happens with the creative writer is you need to do a lot. There's a lot you need to do, and you need to enter your voice through publications, through a variety of contests. You just need to be extraordinarily prolific because the committees are going to be viewing you as a potential future creative writer. And what they're going to want to know is that you're going to go out there and be able to churn out a lot of work. That's what's going to make you, you know, stand us apart from anybody else who's just like, I love to write creatively. So there's a very high standard for showing mastery in creative writing. But again, we can do it and we do it with our students all the time. It's just you really need to be pushed to not just like write for fun or write for yourself or write a 150-page novel. That doesn't mean anything. They want to know, how good is this? So you really need some of the outside accolades to qualify your talent, right? To really give you that kind of credibility that other creative writers might not have. Have we seen any change in the admissions process since Harvard lost the suit to students for fair admission? 100%. We have seen a change. The biggest change has actually not been what I would say for the better. What's really changed is that Harvard is still holding to its standards the way it always has. So I would say the big difference is we used to get B+ students in Harvard every day. They just looked very interesting on the page, and that is no longer possible. That is no longer the case. So for Harvard now, they have just become the grades and scores standards have become non-negotiable. Whereas before, you could compensate on the extracurriculars and the leadership for a slight lack in grades and scores because Harvard actually always valued that side more. But since this ruling came down, Harvard essentially said, okay, the standards now, like Asian families, you guys set the standard. And we are now only picking from those kids who are at the very top of their class with the very highest scores, with very, very few exceptions. And those few exceptions are if you are truly talented at a national level, whether it is in sports or in music, or in STEM. So let's say you're winning like number one ISEF, but you have a B+ in English. That's something that will probably be okay. But for the most part, the standards of that very first silo have gone through the roof. So for Harvard in particular, those recommendation letters, they always mattered a ton. But it was the grades and scores that they were a little bit more flexible on, and now they have ceased to be. So that is honestly what has changed. How do the colleges treat twins? Very, very interesting question. So twins it's a little bit of a mixed bag. They are treated as individuals, but they are also treated as a set. So, in that sense, if there is one of the set that they really, really want, and they get a very strong sense that they are not going to be able to take one without accepting the other can sometimes ride on the coattails of the first. But if that doesn't exist there, the opposite can be true, and the weaker twin can sometimes hold back the stronger twin. So that can happen. And sometimes if the twins are willing to state that they are okay with being separated, that can sometimes help in the admissions process because oftentimes the admissions officers know that oftentimes twins would like to stay together. Um, The AI impact on the application evaluation process is actually very interesting. So, that very first silo that I told you about, there are some select colleges who are using AI to condense the rec letter, kind of like, this is like the final score for the rec letter. So, in addition to looking at the grades and the scores, you might have AI doing like a summary of, it might be something as simple as, this teacher recommends this student highly, but we're seeing in between the lines that there's some reservation, right? So it might be like distilled down into that. And I'm hearing that's mainly how AI is being used in the process. There are also some schools that are using tools to detect AI writing in the process. And we are very attuned to that. So again, we're not letting our students go in with anything because we're actually running it through the checkers ourselves because we know that once it gets to that other side, it very well may go through a checker, even if it's just at the last stage, which is, oh, we're interested in accepting this kid. Let's just run this through an AI checker. The other way things have changed, though, is like just as an example, for Duke, Duke is now no longer giving a score for the writing piece. So they will take in the essays and they will take in what the essays are saying and what the judgment is of the student, but they are no longer assuming that the student is actually doing all the writing. They know well enough that, and they don't care. So what they are really evaluating is your judgment as opposed to whether or not you really penned every little thing here. Other schools are more purist, and that's why they are running them through AI detectors. Duke cares less about that. So the schools are reacting a little bit differently to these inputs, but I would say you should feel, I would say you do not let your kid apply with anything that is AI generated. And if your kids don't have the help of an advisor that is checking this, make sure that you are checking it because assume at the back end the schools will ultimately run it through. And if it comes up as 95% AI generated, I think that could result in a refusal and a denial. The AO cannot see the applicants' names. That is actually hidden. So names and race are actually not shown. Important or beneficial to have athletic abilities? Very, very interesting question. So what happens with athletics is athletics are always a good to have, but there is a very fine line between athletics helping and athletics hurting. If a student is spending an extraordinary amount of time on athletics, which is very often the case with varsity athletics, and they do not ultimately become recruited athletes, this will often eclipse other opportunities, such as, holding leadership positions on the student newspaper, holding leadership positions in debate, holding leadership positions in student government, because so much time has been sucked up by the sport. So when that happens, that can really hurt a candidate. When it can help a candidate is if that candidate is actually being recruited for the sport. That is a huge benefit. So if you are being recruited for sports, you will definitely have a huge advantage, even if you do not have any of those traditional leadership experiences, even if you have fewer awards than some of your peers, because the assumption is you have gained mastery on a national level. And when you have gained mastery on a national level, the colleges really respect that and want it and are willing to forgive some weaknesses on the other side of that. But the problem with sports is that even the kids who think they're going to be recruited sometimes will get injured or they just won't be able to run fast enough or break this record that they thought they'd be able to break. And that's when it can actually serve as a disadvantage because invariably sports comes at the expense of something else when it's taken that seriously. Over, let's say, the last 5 years, is it harder for Asian students to get into US colleges now? Are there certain quotas and have those quotas narrowed? Meaning, are they taking fewer Asian students and many other Asians versus Chinese? So that is actually a really interesting question. And I'm a little bit, I'm an MIT grad, so I'm a little bit of a data geek, and I like to do a lot of that in-depth analysis. And what's been very interesting is since the Supreme Court ruling that you cannot take race into account, we've seen different things happen. So there are some schools at which actually the Asian population has gone up as a percentage of students. So in that way, Asians on the whole have come out stronger. And those are basically they're yeah, schools like MIT and Columbia. Actually, the Asian population went up a little bit. So some of the things they naturally valued happened to show up more in these Asian applications and led to a rise. But there are other schools like Yale and Princeton for whom it actually went down, but just a few percentage points. So it almost felt like Yale and Princeton, in reaction to that ruling, which I think they were very upset about, actually decided to say, you know what, you know, we are going to value and in their minds they're putting certain things at the top of the bucket that might not be considered stereotypically Asian. There are certain stereotypes and admissions that Asians are not always intellectually curious, that they're not always into learning for the sake of learning, that they're interested in making money, that they're not creative, that they're trying to go down very set and safe, very safe paths. So that in Yale and Princeton's mind became a disadvantage. So they were taking actually fewer Asian applicants as a result. So, it's gone both ways. And in terms of taking other Asians versus Chinese students, I actually see that happening right now. So that's really just started. Um, but we're not really talking about Asian Americans in that context, but I am seeing signs writing on the wall and signs from some pressures from DC that is essentially saying, you know what, take fewer Chinese applicants and take more from, let's say, Korea or from Indonesia or from Thailand. So that is definitely happening. Japan. There's definitely a little bit now on the rise, a little bit of an anti-Asia sentiment. And I even had something very alarming happen with one of my students who was being interviewed. And it literally, to me, when she described the interview to me, she's a kid, she wouldn't have known that any of these questions were unusual, but I deeply questioned it. And it were literally these questions were like, why did your parents decide to move to the US? Do your parents have friends or friendships with other parents at the school? We're talking about a Chinese immigrant family that did not yet have a US passport. And it was literally like they were grilling them as potential spies, the student. And, at first it was like, oh, ask me a lot of questions about my time in China and my parents and this and that. And I was like, wow, that is crazy. Like that is the first time I have seen that. But you know what? You play with the game you're given, you play with the hand you're given. I helped that student write a really compelling thank you note to the interviewer that basically said, like, I'm so grateful for my interview with you. And one of the things that really stands out is how much my thinking has changed while living in America and how my values have become more American. And literally, that's what we leaned into because that's what you have to do right now. Um, Let me see. Okay, so recommendation letters. What is your advice on how to choose the people who write your recommendation and how to make the request? I'm asking because teachers may know the student well and have a good rapport, but they may not be the best writer or communicator. Any tips on how to increase that effectiveness from a recommendation letter? So one of the things that I always recommend to students is that they help if their teacher is willing, and the counselors are always willing, but the teachers in particular, if they're willing, it's always nice to come to give them something written that they can use in helping them draft the letter. So the way students can really do this is they can really just say, I know how hard it is for you to write, letters for so many students like me who are asking. So I just thought it might be helpful to you if I wrote up some things about myself and my takeaways from this particular class and some of my most memorable moments and some of the lessons that, impacted me the most, things like that, so that you're really giving your teachers something that they can essentially copy and paste should they want to. You're giving them material to use. So that is something we work on with our students, and I would definitely suggest that you do that with yours. Um, so, which teachers you have to get letters of recommendation from? You need one either English or history, and sometimes a foreign language. So one humanities, and then you're going to need one in either math or science. Those letters need to be from your junior year. So those are generally the required letters. What values and cultural discrimination are you talking about? Please give examples. Yes, absolutely. So I would say the values and cultural discrimination are really rooted in um, this idea in the admissions committee's minds that Asian families are often intolerant of risks. So, as an example, they are often not entirely comfortable with their kids going down creative paths, becoming writers or filmmakers or historians or academics, right? That they're trying to set them up more for very high paying jobs in the world of, let's say, finance or engineering. That's the kind of cultural mindset that they're coming at. Again, the other stereotype I would say that is often on display is the idea of, this may not be a kid who just reads out of curiosity. This is a kid who's just reading self-help books or books that will help them get ahead in their careers, right? They want students who are at that moment in time more aspirational, a little bit more dreamy, um, a little, they want, again, they want students who just want to do something different and make the world a better place. And a lot of times what they see in the Asian applicant is the kid who's just set up to to do well financially. So that is what I would say they generally speaking, would discriminate against is a kid who's not willing to kind of take enough risks and do enough interesting, different things, or, just follow the same path that everyone else is following. So that's one of the things that we really try to do to distinguish our students from one another. Um, for an Asian student, is there any negative impact if the rec letter comes from an Asian teacher? Um, I would say that, in in general, probably not in general, but I will say that for extra letters of recommendation, generally speaking, I would say you are more likely to avoid subconscious bias if you are not getting more than one rec letter from an Asian person. So I would say I wouldn't, obviously, if you're getting a letter from someone in, let's say, AP Chinese, or you're getting a letter from a science teacher who happens to be Asian, I don't think that's going to hurt you. But if you're talking about, getting all your letters or getting some extra letters and they're all from Chinese people, the credibility might start to become questioned because there's always this kind of question of, is this just someone my kid networks with? Or the families network with, or know like really well and take out to dinner all the time. They're really looking for, to poke holes in possible credibility or authenticity. So you just want to be careful about it. The schools also actually oftentimes get to know the recommenders, and even in one particular case, there was a school that knew the teacher's letter so well that they actually called the guidance office and said something seems weird here because we know the way this particular teacher writes her letters, and this doesn't seem like her writing. And lo and behold, it was a counselor at the school who ended up being fired, who had actually tried to embellish the recommendation letter, thinking they would be helping the student, and ultimately got caught. They're looking extremely closely at those letters. So just know that those letters are a big, especially at the top schools when they have so many kids with perfect grades and perfect scores, they're using those letters to differentiate kids. Um, if an activity was largely pursued only in elementary, middle school years and no longer pursued as a high school student, is it still meaningful to include this in application that essays? Can a personal recommendation letter from that activities coach help? No, it cannot help. So the high school application needs to reflect the high school activities. If it's something you stopped doing in middle school, it is no longer valuable. So, all right. So now, you know what? If we have 10 minutes left, I'd like to throw it. Mixed race students, Jewish, Asian. They're, again, they don't know. So unless you talk about it, they don't know. It's all about the story. And how do you create a narrative if you do not yet know what you want to do or are undecided? That's when you can still paint a narrative of broad strokes, like I want to make the world a better place. I don't know exactly what I want to do, but this is where my interests lie, and you can still create a narrative out of that. And then I'm going to throw it over to V, and if you have any like Princeton specific questions, this is the time to ask them. So go for it, V, take it away.
Thanks so much. I'm going to try to compact this because there's so much that you said that I completely agree with. So I'm going to try to add some nuance. First, this is coming from years of experience in Princeton admissions. And so here's what I have to say. The first thing that everybody should know is that in admissions, we get our files of applicants and we have anywhere from 5 to 7 minutes to review them. So you can understand the kind of mindset we're in. Everybody starts to kind of run together when everyone has great grades, great SATs, and the same activities. And so if I could give recommendations to parents and to students is you need to find ways to differentiate yourself, right? You need to have that baseline of good grades, good SATs, but then give me something more. So when I read your application, I remember you. And I say, oh, this is the student who did this kind of research or who participated in this really unique activity, something that's going to stand out. So that's my first most important recommendation. And to touch on what Leelila said about the series of pre-college programs at elite universities, yes, for admissions, this looks like a lateral move. If every year you're doing a pre-college program at Harvard, at Yale, at Stanford, and that's the sum of your 3 years that you're presenting to us, then it tells me that you're not having any growth. What you're doing is consuming knowledge each summer, and you're not producing it at any point. So I would expect 1 year of a good pre-college program, and then the next year you're building on that knowledge and you're contributing to research, or the next year you're interning and you're getting practical work experience. So that tells me that the student is growing and they're actually interested in learning something and learning how to produce. And that's really important. That'll differentiate you. Then in terms of interdisciplinary studies, I completely agree. If a student is STEM oriented, yes, doing history of science is a nice way of combining humanities and STEM, or doing digital humanities. That's another way of combining tech and humanities. Doing public health and policy. That way you're combining medicine, pre-med with political science. So there's ways of having your STEM interests organically flow into something that's interdisciplinary without it looking forced. And then in terms of these traditionally Asian activities, orchestra, chess, yes, these are staples, but they are standouts, and you do need to have staples. You can't just be a wild card because you do need to show us that you are a legitimate student with serious capabilities. And so, yeah, chess is always a standout one. Orchestra, those are those things that kind of tell us that you have a certain caliber. The other thing that I can say is that if you're doing activities though, like I'll give a good example. If you're in Science Olympiad and you're dedicating so much of your time to Science Olympiad, but you're not coming away with awards, then I might even say this is a potential waste of your time because you could dedicate that time that you're spending at being mediocre at Science Olympiad to something that will make you stand out. So do those staple activities, have a couple of them on your resume, but make sure that you're dedicating a good chunk of time to something that will give you that kind of remember you. Like being in Science Olympiad but not winning, being in NHS but not being a leader, being in orchestra but being, not first chair. That won't really tell me anything because it just tells me that you kind of are skating by in a series of nice activities. Then what else did I want to touch on? Yeah, the interdisciplinary activity needs to be believable. And believe me, when we're looking through tens, hundreds of applications, when something seems forced, it becomes very apparent. So just make sure that this is a legitimate and organic interdisciplinary move. It can't be just like, oh, I tacked on history of science, even though you haven't actually studied the history of science, you're just a STEM person. So that's something that I would say too. You need to have awards to back yourself up, research to back yourself up, these interdisciplinary interests. Um, and I would also agree on the international applicant question about are Chinese applicants more likely to get in if they're at boarding schools in the US versus China? Yes, because statistically, universities like Princeton, which I do know, cannot pull infinite applicants from China, right? We have a finite number of applicants we can pull. So you're competing with statistically smaller numbers. So yes, your chances would be much higher if you go to school in the US. And then recommendation letter tips. Again, I completely agree with Leelila. That was a very correct point to make, that if you want to get really good letters, you need to be pulling in the teachers. And you can always tell a recommendation letter where they've just read a resume versus a teacher who's actually been part of your journey. So you need to make sure that when you're applying to a lot of these competitions, they'll ask for a teacher advisor. And so be strategic about which teacher advisors you're asking for help from, right? That way they're witness to your growth every step of the way. And you can always tell the difference between what makes a good and a great letter. Like all letters say, Jane was wonderful, she's very bright, blah, blah. Every letter starts like that. But what's going to make the difference is seeing that there's a maturity of thinking, that there's a growth. That's key, that you're evolving as a student. So that's something that becomes evident when a teacher has been a thorough part of your growth, that the student is talking to the teacher at regular intervals. And again, exactly what Leelila said about more than just, can I get an A? Why can't I get a little bit of a grade bump? Like your conversations need to be a bit more analytical and about getting better and about advancement in thinking. So that's what you need to be considering when you're trying to strategically develop relationships with your teachers. I think I did that under record time. I was taking notes as Leelila was talking to see that I think I
Amazing.
answered questions.
Thank you so
That was
much. Thank
awesome,
you
V.
so much, V. Yes. Well, Leelila and V, this has been such an important and, fascinating conversation about what happens behind the magic curtain. So to close out here, please, Leelila, can you give us one sentence on how parents and children and families can make the most of these precious few months, few years that they have together as a household before the college journey begins? So just one sentence from the heart on how to make the most of family time together before our children start leaving the nest.
Teach your students to be creators and not just consumers.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.